The phrase, "this is a witch hunt," landed in that Senate hearing room the way it always does when Ilhan Omar says it, not as a suggestion, but as a verdict delivered with absolute moral confidence. It had the rhythm of someone who believes she's been chased before and refused to be caught, and the volume of a politician who learned early that quiet can get you erased. She called it a witch hunt against the Somali community, a campaign against Muslim Americans, a misuse of a formal chamber to paint an entire group with suspicion. She warned that the whole spectacle reeked of Islamophobia, and that anyone watching should be alarmed by what she said the administration was turning government into. And as she said it, she rose to her feet, even though witnesses in that room aren't supposed to stand. Ilhan Omar has never been especially interested in what the rule book says she's supposed to do, especially when she thinks the moment rewards defiance. She pointed across the dais with a rigid finger, her voice pushing into every corner of the Russell Building chamber with the practiced fury that has made her both famous and polarizing. In the chair, she was aiming at sat Vice President J.D. Vance, hands folded in front of him, posture steady, expression giving away almost nothing. He didn't flinch at the finger, didn't react to the volume, didn't reach for water, or swivel toward counsel the way most people do when they're being dressed down on camera. He stayed still, like a man who grew up in a home where shouting was just background noise, and stillness was the only way to keep your footing. There are people who panic when voices rise, and there are people who learned, years ago, that storms burn themselves out if you don't feed them. Vance looked like the second type, the kind shaped by chaos at home and hardened by it, the kind who learned that the loudest person isn't always the one with control. He waited until Omar finished, and then he let the quiet sit there, long enough for the cameras to capture the contrast between her heat and his calm. 2 seconds, 3 seconds, just enough time for the room to realize this wasn't going to be a tidy exchange of talking points. Then he spoke in a voice that carried Southern Ohio and a faint Appalachian edge, unhurried, measured, and built for storytelling. He addressed her by name, thanked her for appearing, and told the committee he wanted to share something not included in the standard briefing materials. He said it wasn't a prop, and the pause that followed didn't feel like showmanship so much as a man choosing the right doorway into memory. He said he grew up in Middletown, Ohio, with a mother battling OxyContin and heroin, a carousel of rehab, relapse, boyfriends, and evictions that forced a child to learn adult math too early. He described a father who signed away parental rights before a boy was old enough to fully understand what that kind of abandonment means in real life. He spoke about being raised by his grandmother, Bonnie Vance, known as Mama, who came out of eastern Kentucky with an 8th-grade education and a temperament that could cut through a room. He painted it with specific, unglamorous details: Goodwill shoes, government cheese, school lunch as the biggest meal, and a town watching its economic spine collapse. He described Middletown's mills closing, families breaking, and the opioid epidemic stripping the future out of people he once sat next to in class. He said he wasn't talking down to Omar from comfort, and he wasn't asking questions from some untouched perch. He was speaking from a place that also knew hunger, instability, and the fear that tomorrow would be worse than today. And then he delivered the pivot that mattered, the line that reframed the room. The difference, he said, wasn't where they began, but what they did with the chances they were given. He said when America offered him a path, he put on a Marine Corps uniform and went to Iraq. And when America offered Omar a path, he argued she used her platform to describe the September 11th attacks as some people did something, to compare the U.S. military to the Taliban, and to sponsor legislation that later became tied in the public mind to a massive fraud scandal. He said, plainly, he wasn't there to target her religion or her community, and he wasn't interested in painting entire groups with blame. He said he was there to ask what her own constituents were asking, the question that hangs over every public figure when the cameras stop flattering them. What did you do with the opportunity? The room didn't just go quiet, it recalibrated, as if everyone simultaneously realized the hearing they expected had already evaporated. To understand why that exchange felt so combustible, you have to roll the tape back to the morning, before either side had been forced to adjust. Ilhan Omar arrived at the Russell Building early, surrounded by the standard crisis management formation: attorney, chief of staff, communications staff who had spent days rehearsing the angles. They weren't improvising, they were running what they considered a reliable playbook, built from years of surviving televised ambushes. Their theory was simple: when Republicans come for Omar, the attack is never only about policy or paperwork, it's about identity. And you beat an identity attack with an identity defense. They expected the hearing to orbit familiar magnets: her faith, her background, her symbolism, and they believed they knew how to turn that orbit into fuel. Her attorney, a former DOJ prosecutor in your typical Washington armor, told her the likely line of fire would be feeding our future, campaign connections, guilt by association, and selective outrage. They planned to emphasize that the legislation at issue was designed to feed kids during a pandemic, and that criminals exploited loopholes, as criminals do, without making the legislator the criminal. They rehearsed the redirect. This hearing is supposed to be about program vulnerability, not about tweets from years ago, not about inflammatory headlines, not about a relitigation of every controversy. They predicted Vance would stick to decorum because he's the vice president, and that he'd let senators handle the sharp elbows while he played the role of presiding adult. Meanwhile, Omar's staff watched social media and saw the early signals of support flickering on: solidarity messages, hashtags climbing, fundraising drafts ready to be launched. That machine for years has often worked in her favor, because conflict is currency, and Omar is a magnet for conflict. Every attack becomes content, and content becomes fundraising, and fundraising becomes survival in a political world that rewards outrage even when it pretends to despise it. Omar's story: refugee, survivor, outsider who made it into the halls built by insiders, has long been her shield and her sword. Her team expected the same cycle. Republicans strike, she reframes it as bigotry, allies rally, and the narrative ends with her stronger than before. What they didn't fully prepare for, because no one in their circle thought they needed to, was an opponent who could meet her trauma story with his own and make the identity frame wobble. They had researched J.D. Vance the way Washington researchers always do: Yale Law, venture capital, Peter Thiel connections, senator turned vice president, and the brand built around hillbilly elegy. In their minds, he was an Ivy League Republican who used a poor white story as a ladder, someone they could portray as privileged cosplay with a Rust Belt accent. That was the lens they planned to force on him. Rich man lectures, refugee, and the audience, especially their audience, reacts the way they always react. What they hadn't absorbed, or hadn't absorbed deeply enough, was the specific texture of his childhood story. The details that don't read like an abstract resume bullet. They knew the title of the book. They didn't fully carry the scenes, and those scenes were the weapon he brought into the room. A few blocks away, in a secure office that smelled like paperwork and power, Vance and his team were reviewing a folder that wasn't thick with spreadsheets or filing minutiae. Not because they lacked data, but because they weren't planning to win by drowning the room in numbers, and also because other Republicans had already worked that territory. Vance's folder, as described by those who like to talk, was built around transcripts, clips, timestamps, and Omar's public record. Her words, her phrasing, her most replayed moments. His chief of staff predicted she would play the identity card because it has historically been her most effective defense when cornered in a hostile environment. Vance's answer, according to that plan, was to make the identity card slide right off him by refusing to attack identity at all, and instead reading back what she herself had said. He reportedly told his team that if she tried to label him privileged, the country already knew the Middletown story, and not as a marketing slogan, but as a lived narrative. He mentioned his mother's addiction, his father's absence, and his grandmother's stabilizing presence, not as sympathy bait, but as an antidote to the simplistic frame. Then he opened to a transcript from a 2019 speech and fixated on the phrase, "Some people did something," because he knew how it hits a certain part of the American psyche. He said he enlisted because of 9/11, and he said a lot of young Americans did. And the difference between some people and terrorists isn't grammar, it's moral temperature. He reportedly framed it as two journeys from poverty, one from Appalachia, one from Somalia, and told his staff he would let the country compare what those journeys produced. When the hearing began, it was billed with a title that sounded like bureaucratic oatmeal: Oversight, Vulnerability, Pandemic-Era Spending, Federal Nutrition Programs. The early hours unfolded like most oversight proceedings do, thick with mechanics and institutional language that makes eyes glaze over. Officials testified about the Feeding Our Future fraud, how claims were filed for meals that were never served, how money moved through shell companies, how luxury purchases replaced children's food. The numbers were outrageous by any standard, and the scale was the kind that makes ordinary voters feel like the system is an unlocked house in a bad neighborhood. A major point repeated by witnesses was that prosecutions had already happened, convictions had already been secured, and yet the public still felt the wound was open because the moral injury lingers after the legal one. The geography and demographics of the story only sharpened the politics. Much of the activity clustered in Minneapolis's Cedar Riverside neighborhood, a hub for the Somali American community that Omar represents. Observers noted that many charged defendants were of Somali descent, while the organization's founder, Amy Bach, is white and had been convicted too, a fact that complicates the lazy, ugly narratives some people rush toward. Omar listened the way seasoned politicians listen when the facts are unflattering, but the camera is running. Still face, controlled posture, minimal reaction. Her attorney took notes. Her team tracked feeds, and the assumption remained that Omar would survive by reframing the whole event as a political attack wearing an investigative costume. When it was her turn, she delivered a statement crafted to do exactly that. She began with her origin story, born in Mogadishu, years in a refugee camp, arriving in America as a child without English, and built the familiar arc from survival to elected office. She said she had been investigated, threatened, vilified, and that she was in that room because the majority wanted to weaponize her community's suffering. She looked at Vance and described him as a man born with every advantage, accusing him of using the committee to target a refugee, an immigrant, a Muslim woman, because it served his politics. She insisted the proceeding wasn't truly about fraud, but about fear. Fear of immigrants, fear of Muslims, fear of a black woman speaking in halls made for others. In that instant, her team likely felt the relief of a plan executing cleanly. She'd established the frame before the first sharp question could land, turning the hearing into a referendum on prejudice, rather than a drill down on responsibility. The gallery reacted predictably, with sympathetic nods and the quiet signals of a supportive crowd. If Vance had been the caricature they expected, he would have sputtered, bristled, or leaned into indignation, all of which would have strengthened her framing. Instead, he waited, and then he challenged one detail, not with insult, but with autobiography. He said the record needed correcting because he wasn't born into every advantage, and he described Middletown, not as a campaign stop, but as a place where the air itself felt like decline. He said his mother cycled through addiction and instability so many times he counted the relapses, because counting is what kids do when they want to pretend chaos has a pattern. He described the father who left, and the homes that changed depending on which boyfriend was in the picture, and the grandmother who stayed sober enough to keep him safe. He spoke about Goodwill shoes, school lunch, and enlisting in 2003 because he didn't know how to apply to college, and a Marine recruiter offered structure. Then he looked at Omar and said, with respect for what she survived, that he wasn't talking from privilege. He was asking from the same kind of beginning. That is where the room shifted, not like a thunderclap, but like an audience realizing the stage is not what they assumed. Omar entered as the underdog refugee against the powerful vice president, and Vance complicated that storyline by refusing to be the villain in it. He didn't deny her hardship. He matched the category of hardship with his own and made the identity argument less clean. The contrast became two versions of survival staring at each other across polished wood and institutional history. You could almost hear staffers in the background recalculating which clips would help them and which would haunt them. Omar tried to pull it back to the frame, saying his personal story didn't change the reality that the hearing was being used to target her. Vance answered that he wanted to talk about her words, not what others had said about her, and he made it sound like a fair principle instead of a trap. He opened his folder and cited the 2019 CARE speech, quoting the "some people did something" line verbatim, then looked up and let the words hang. He spoke about 2,977 dead, about the specificity of that day, about how some people feels like a moral downshift when families are still counting anniversaries. He said he enlisted in 2003 because of 9/11, like many young Americans did, and that he saw that phrase not as policy critique, but as diminishment. Omar responded that she was speaking about civil liberties after 9/11, about surveillance and profiling and discrimination. Vance said if that was her intent, she could have said that directly, and he implied the problem wasn't misunderstanding, but choice of wording. He noted that dissent about foreign policy is protected and often necessary, and he even said he himself has criticized the Iraq War, which was designed to deny her the "you can't criticize America" counterattack. But he insisted there's a line between critique and minimizing, and that her phrasing stepped into a place that still stings people who lived through the aftermath. In that moment, his strategy was obvious: agree where he could, then isolate where he believed her language crossed into something else. He moved to the 2021 statement that placed the U.S. alongside Hamas and the Taliban in a list about atrocities, and he read it as written, without adding adjectives. He said he served with Marines who fought the Taliban, who came home broken, and that seeing the U.S. placed beside the Taliban isn't just controversial, but offensive to those who risked their lives. Omar's face tightened the way a witness's face tightens when the defense plan starts slipping and the room isn't cooperating. Vance told her, essentially, that if context changes the meaning, the context should be stated clearly right there, and he offered silence as a challenge. She didn't rescue it, because some lines are hard to reframe once read aloud in an official chamber. He turned to her all about the Benjamins comment and her reference to IPAC, noting how easily that language slides into a stereotype with a long, destructive history. He pointed out that she did apologize, but he distinguished apology from clarification, implying that clarification can sound like "you didn't get it" rather than "I was wrong." He argued that she cannot demand protection for her community while using rhetoric that other communities experience as prejudice, and he framed tolerance as a two-way street. Omar's attorney signaled restraint, the quiet don't react touch that lawyers use when they want to keep a client from handing the other side a viral moment. But the hearing had already turned into a collision of narratives, and narrative collisions make people forget to follow signals. Vance then moved from words to the core scandal, and he did it in a way designed to feel reluctant rather than gleeful. He acknowledged the stated purpose of pandemic-era nutrition expansion as good and humane, because attacking that purpose would make him look cruel. He argued, though, that loosening safeguards created openings that criminals exploited, and that what followed became a prosecution of historic size. He named the dollar amount, around $250 million, and described the betrayal of a program meant to feed kids, then emphasized the embarrassment and harm to the very community Omar says she is defending. He brought up the public reporting about investigations into whether any stolen funds might have reached dangerous groups overseas, and he kept it framed as investigation and concern, not a declared fact, because declared facts are where you get burned. That's when Omar snapped back to her familiar shield, calling the line of questioning racist and Islamophobic, and accusing him of demonizing immigrants. She attacked the idea that he could use his own poverty story as a weapon against hers, and she accused him of trying to bully her into gratitude on command. The room tightened again because racist and Islamophobic are not just labels in that context. They are incendiary allegations, especially against someone occupying the vice presidency. Vance didn't raise his voice, and that itself became part of the contrast, because the calmer person often reads as stronger on video. He waited for her volume to subside, like someone who has watched arguments burn themselves out before. Then he told the story of his grandmother again, and he told it as if it wasn't a political device, but a moral compass. He described her leaving Kentucky young, working factories, carrying pride in the country that let her build a life, and never forgetting the gap between having nothing and having a chance. He described her gratitude as daily habit, and he used that to make a bigger point without ever saying, "You should feel this way," because direct lecturing is where you lose viewers. He framed her as a kind of internal refugee, escaping poverty rather than war. So the comparison to Omar's story could feel less like appropriation and more like parallel. Then he landed the knife politely. If his grandmother were there, he suggested, she would say, "America saved you, so act like it." Whether you agree with that sentiment or recoil from it, you can see why it played the way it did. It wasn't a spreadsheet argument. It was a values argument disguised as biography. It made the hearing about posture toward the country, not merely oversight of a program. And posture is where audiences form instant judgments. Vance insisted he wasn't questioning Omar's right to serve, her citizenship, her faith, or the legitimacy of her election, because that disclaimer makes the criticism feel fair even to people who are wary of it. Then he returned to the theme. You can criticize America, he said, but there is a difference between criticism and contempt, and he implied her language reads as contempt to many Americans. He said the tragedy is that the collateral damage of her rhetoric falls not on her, but on ordinary Somali Americans who want quiet lives and steady work, and get associated with scandal they didn't commit. He said Muslim Americans who love this country have to carry the burden of her most controversial phrasing in conversations with neighbors who already suspect them. He said immigrants from every corner of the world take the oath with tears because they remember what they fled, and that watching a leader sound dismissive of America creates a kind of cultural whiplash. He ended by yielding time, which made it look as if he wasn't chasing her down. He was letting the record speak. Omar remained standing, angry, refusing to let the moment close neatly. She told him he didn't get to instruct an immigrant how to feel, and that he didn't get to turn his grandmother's story into a club. She accused him of using emotion to dodge the reality that she believes Muslim communities are targeted, and she returned to the claim that the hearing was designed to criminalize her people. She attacked hillbilly elegy as an exploitation narrative, arguing he blamed poor people and profited from it, and she claimed he now used power to punish immigrants. Vance's response was short and coldly strategic. He wasn't telling her what to feel, he said. He was reading what she said, because her words belonged to her. He repeated that he didn't write her tweets, didn't write the controversies into existence, and that the public could decide what those words reveal about her approach. From there, the hearing ended the way so many modern hearings end, not with resolution, but with an exit that feels like a cliffhanger. Omar left without offering the press the kind of combative soundbite she usually supplies, and that absence became its own story. Clips immediately broke into fragments optimized for different tribes, with different emotional temperatures. Each group convinced their fragment was the whole truth. One fragment elevated the grandmother story, turning it into a symbol of gratitude and resilience, complete with photos and sentimental overlays that practically wrote the caption themselves. Another fragment focused on contempt, compressing a complicated argument into a single moral accusation that people could wear like a badge. A third wave took on a life of its own, and this is where, in my view, the story got genuinely interesting. It wasn't just Republicans cheering Vance or Democrats defending Omar, because that dynamic is predictable and frankly boring at this point. It was the eruption of immigrants themselves, across backgrounds, saying in plain language that they didn't feel represented by Omar's posture. They spoke about boats, camps, dictatorships, shortages, families lost, and the moment of arriving in America feeling like being handed oxygen. They didn't all agree on policy, and they didn't all share the same politics, but many shared one emotional baseline. Gratitude is not a slogan, it's a memory. A Vietnamese-American grandmother recorded a simple phone video talking about fleeing after Saigon, surviving the sea, and remembering who opened the door. A Cuban-American academic wrote about his mother kissing the ground at the airport, gratitude turning into a family tradition rather than a partisan argument. A Nigerian-American doctor posted about taking the oath and crying because he remembered a world where basic medical supplies were a miracle, not a budget line item. A Gold Star mother held up a photo of her son and made the point without drama, the way grief sometimes does. Her child did not die because some people did something. He died because terrorists did. These weren't official witnesses, and that's why they mattered. Because in America, the unofficial witness often moves hearts faster than any senator ever will. Omar held a press event afterward with allies and attorneys, calling the hearing Islamophobic and xenophobic, and accusing Vance of emotional manipulation. Her statement was carefully structured to hit framing and motive, while dodging the most combustible quotes, because that's what professionals do when they don't want to relitigate a bad clip. She didn't spend time on "some people did something," and she didn't meaningfully grapple with why that phrase still hits like a nerve. She didn't linger on the Taliban comparison, and she didn't absorb the immigrant backlash head-on, because absorbing it would mean treating those immigrants as moral equals rather than political props. And when millions have already watched the grandmother clip and the words on the record refrain, they notice what you don't address as much as what you do. The problem her team ran into is structural, not personal. The identity defense playbook works best when the opponent is easily cast as privileged, cruel, or culturally distant, because the audience already wants that story. It works worse when the opponent has his own poverty scars and can speak in the language of survival without sounding like an anthropologist. You can dismiss a rich man's patriotism as performance. It's harder to dismiss a poor man's gratitude as simple privilege. Once the frame changes from identity to choices, the defense gets more complicated, because you can't hide choices behind birth forever. In the weeks after, a new label began attaching itself to Omar in public conversation, not because Vance used it explicitly, but because audiences translated what they heard into a simpler word. He used contempt, which is a precise term, and the public often converts precision into a sharper, easier headline. That headline became ungrateful, a word that carries judgment but also sticks because it maps onto a visceral American expectation about the relationship between opportunity and attitude. To be clear, labeling is not proof of anything. It's an emotional verdict, and emotional verdicts spread faster than facts. But once a label attaches, it becomes a filter through which every future statement is read, fairly or unfairly. That's what made the hearing feel bigger than policy. It wasn't only about fraud mechanics or oversight gaps or the familiar partisan dance around scandal. It was about the tension between grievance and gratitude, and whether Americans believe the right response to being saved is to say thank you or to demand more forever. You can argue that gratitude should never be required, that citizens owe their country critique, not worship, and you can argue that's exactly what makes America worth defending. You can also argue that contempt for the country that took you in is a dangerous posture in public leadership because it spills onto communities who just want to live quietly. In my view, what viewers responded to was not a courtroom-style gotcha, but a story comparison that forced people to weigh two kinds of suffering and two kinds of outcomes. Mogadishu and Middletown, refugee camp and opioid house. A child translating chaos into survival, a teenager translating hunger into service. Two lives shaped by forces outside their control, both arriving in the American system, both using its megaphone, and then speaking about the country in radically different tones. That contrast doesn't prove anything criminal, and it doesn't settle any policy question. But it does illuminate why the public's emotional reaction was so intense. Because politics, at the end of the day, is not only about what happened, it's about what people think your posture says about who you are. And that's the part that the polished strategists sometimes miss. You can win a procedural argument and still lose the room, because people don't vote on procedure. They vote on vibes wrapped in values. Omar tried to make the moment about bigotry, and Vance tried to make it about words and choices, and the public decided which story felt more honest. Not because the public is always fair, but because the public is always human, and humans judge quickly when stories collide. Mama would have understood that instinct, because people like her learned long ago that gratitude and resentment are both contagious, and the one you spread becomes your reputation. By the time the building emptied and the cameras moved on, the damage and the momentum were already baked in. Not legal damage, not anything that fits neatly into an indictment-shaped box, but narrative damage, the kind that sticks to a person's public image like smoke in a coat. Omar could call it a smear, and Vance could call it accountability. But the country heard something simpler. Two Americans arguing over what America means and whether "I survived" automatically cancels out "I'm responsible." That's not a court question, It's a cultural one, and cultural questions don't get resolved by footnotes. What came next was predictable in the way storms are predictable. You know they're coming. You just don't know where the lightning lands. Allies rushed to Omar's defense with the language they've used 100 times, targeting, demonizing, Islamophobia. And some of that was sincere, because prejudice is real, and people have watched it mutate into policy before. But other observers, including plenty of people who would never vote Republican, couldn't shake the feeling that the defense was being used as a blanket, thrown over every uncomfortable detail, so nothing had to be addressed directly. When a defense becomes the entire conversation, the original issue doesn't disappear. It just festers. Meanwhile, Vance's team did what modern political teams do. They didn't celebrate loudly. They just distributed the clips and let the audience do the heavy lifting. A grandmother story here, a your words line there, a tight shot of Omar standing and Vance sitting still. No dramatic music required, because Americans supply their own when they're already emotionally invested. And the more Omar insisted the hearing was really about identity, the more it invited a counter-question that's hard to unask once it's in your head. If it's only about identity, why do the quotes keep landing so clean? The strangest twist was watching the conversation drift away from senators and back toward ordinary immigrants. Not activists, not consultants, not the usual talking heads, just people who remember what it meant to arrive here with nothing and decide, privately, that gratitude isn't weakness. That current didn't erase legitimate concerns about discrimination, and it didn't magically solve anyone's policy arguments. But it complicated the neat storyline Omar needed. Because it suggested that the fight wasn't simply America versus Muslims or Republicans versus immigrants. Sometimes it was immigrants arguing among themselves about what respect, criticism, and belonging are supposed to look like when you finally get a seat at the table. And that's where the hearing left the country. Not with answers, but with a sharper question hanging in the air. If you can't separate real bias from strategic deflection, how do you evaluate anyone fairly? If you can't separate accountability from opportunism, how do you trust oversight at all? The marble room went quiet, but the argument didn't end. It just moved into the bloodstream of the culture, where it can run for years without ever needing a verdict.